All righty. Hello. Peace and power and elevation be to all the beautiful people out there in the world. This your girl Tiffany coming through here live in the fed. Live in the fed. So on today's topic, I deal with Black history. All right. So Black history is a never-ending subject. It's a constant thing, 365 days in a year. All right. So it's a lot to uncover when it comes to our history and our ancestors, especially here in America. All right. And throughout other places. So I have a long list of things that I wanted to get into. All right. So this topic for today will be about Lennar Black. So Leonard Black was an American slave and he was an author. He wrote his autobiography, which is called The Life and Suffering of Leonard Black, a Fugitive from Slavery. Okay. So before I go any further, please make sure you subscribe to my channel, like my channel, share my channel, hit the notification bell, all that great stuff. Okay. Please do that. And for those of you that have been subscribing to my channel, thank you for coming through. Shout out to you guys. I really appreciate it a lot. That really means a lot to me. Real talk. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on this subject. So we're going to put up some, and then we're going to use other information to back up the source as well. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's get to it. All righty then. So around here, yes, I do a lot of reading, and yes, I have a lot of read materials. That's what I do. Okay. So, oops. So Leonard Black was born on March the 8th of 1820, and he died April 28th of 1883. Okay. So he was born in Enel, Arundel County, Maryland, and was separated from his family by the age of 6. He escaped after 20 years of slavery. In 1847, he wrote The Life and Suffering of Leonard Black, a Fugitive from Slavery. With encouragement and support, he became a Baptist minister preacher in Boston, Providence, and Nantucket before becoming minister of First Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, Virginia. All right, so he was married twice. Hold on. Okay, so he was married twice in his lifetime. His first marriage was to a woman named Mary A. Black, a woman who died at some point in time after 1850, and with whom Black had 5 children. Her father, George Black, was an African American Baptist minister who took him into his home after he escaped slavery and helped him become established. Black's second marriage was to Mary Ann Wooden, with whom he had 2 children with. Okay, so again, he was born as a slave, the youngest of 5 boys. He also had a sister. The family's master was a physician. Okay, and he was sold to a carpenter named Bradford and was separated from his parents at the age of 6. His mother and sister were sold away to people in New Orleans. His 4 brothers were also placed out. Mrs. Bradford, his mistress, was brutal. After 2 years, and fearing that he would be killed by his wife when he was out of town, Mr. Bradford gave the boy to his father, a senior Mr. Bradford, where he served until Mr. Bradford's death. All right. He was abused, beaten, and burned, fed little, and had no personal possessions. At one point, he said, "During this time, I had no hat, no pantaloons, but one pair of shoes, and wore a lacy slip only. He felt he was on like a cow or horse." All right, so It goes on to say when he was 13, the elder Mr. Bradford died with the rest of his property. The boy was inherited by the man's daughter, Elizabeth Bradford, who married a quick-tempered man named Gardner. Throughout his enslavement, he endured hunger, beatings, and harsh treatment. Black was beaten among other times when he acquired books to learn to read. Now, let's stop right there. Imagine being beaten just because you want to learn how to read. Imagine that. Because during his time period, slaves were not allowed to learn how to read or write. They were slaves. They were properties. And that's what they was going to get treated as such. They weren't entitled to human rights. But this man was beaten for learning how to read. Now, the story gets sadder and sadder as you can read along. This happened to be the most saddest subject I have ever done about someone in history, someone who's a figurative in history. So let's continue and let's see what else we can find. Black returned to his old master and met up with his 4 brothers. The 3 oldest boys ran away soon after his return. 6 months later, Black ran away but was returned and spent about another 10 years in slavery. His brother Nicholas remained in slavery with him. At times, his situation was alleviated by the intervention of the man's son, a preacher. Black related his experiences with some of the people in the Bible and found strength in the verse, I experienced a hope under a slave man, and give us of your oil, for our lamps have gone out. He converted to Christianity in 1836. Now, we don't understand. Many of them converted to Christianity because, for one, Christianity was a dominant religion at that time period. And then, 2, on top of that, many of them sought salvation. I'm going to say again, many of them sought salvation through Christianity. They thought Christianity was the foundation for them. Was the way to escape, to heal from their problems. So that's why many of them turned into reading the Bible, because they felt they can find connection in the book. They can find some form of peace. And they was able to use it for their own interpretation. Now, we're going to go down to where they talk about freedom. In 1837, after 20 years enslavement, Black decided to escape and go north to meet up with his 3 brothers. He thought his family was either in Boston, Massachusetts, or Canada. He believed he had the support of his friend Henry, but Henry informed his master that Black had escaped. Black left with 75 cents and the clothes he was wearing. He traveled to Boston working odd jobs to earn money for food. He resisted attempts to be captured throughout his travels. In Boston, he was told that there was a man named George Black, a Baptist minister from the West Indies in Port, Maine. But when he arrived, he found that he was not related to Mr. Black. George Black and his family were kind to him. Mrs. Black was like a mother to him, and he became attached to the couple's daughter. Clothes were made for him, and he attended school to learn to read and write. In the spring, he went to work for a farmer named Major Purley. He returned to Portland, lived with George Black and his family, and worked as an engineer at a steam factory. Okay. So it goes on to talk about how George Black and his family moved to Boston to become the minister of African Meeting House on Bitnap Street. Leonard went with them. George was the minister of Meeting House from 1838 to 1840. So let's look at what the Meeting House was. The Meeting House, also known as variously the First African Baptist Church, First Independent Baptist Church, the Bitnap Street Church, was built in 1806 and is now the oldest Black church edifice still standing in the United States. It is located in Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. Okay, adjacent to the African American Abel Smith School. It is a national historic landmark. All right. So that's what they went to. Now, people may argue the term, well, these folks didn't call themselves African. Well, as you can see, that's the title right there. It was called the African Meeting House. And peace to Brother Vinyasu. Thank you for coming through. Yeah, it was called the African Meeting House. So obviously, there was the term African incorporated. So they had some form of knowledge of self, right? They knew something about who they were. Right? All right. Anyways, now let's look. Let's go down. So in Boston, by 1840, Black married the daughter of George Black and lived with George in Boston. They also lived at the house of David Walker, the abolitionist, on Joy Street. Over the course of their marriage, the couple had 5 children. Yeah, one of whom died in childhood. Black worked at the wharfs and became a member of the Bennett Street Church. All right, so I'm going to skip some of this, go further down. Well, you know, let me just go ahead and read this first paragraph right here. So after 5 years in Boston, Black moved to Providence, Rhode Island. His first study with Francis Wayland, president of Brown University, and became an active member and student of religion at the Meeting House Street Church, organized as a Baptist church at that time led by Reverend Jeremiah Asher, then the African Union Meeting and Schoolhouse. He was invited to officiate for him one Sunday morning, as he knew I was accustomed to exhorting when in Boston. He took up work as a stonemason, and his family joined him in Providence. All right. Nantucket, after his accident, Black was determined to become a preacher. He traveled to Nantucket with a letter of recommendation from 2 Providence preachers for Deacon Berry. All right. So it says novel or slave narrative. So it goes in and talk about his book, which I have available. And you can also look it up on Google. Just download the book. It's free to download on the PDF. And it says he wrote the book to inform Christians of what slavery was like in hopes of ending slavery, which would free his 4th brother and earn enough money to pursue religious studies. His autobiography includes a poem entitled The Traveling Pringle and an essay on slavery. All right. So of slavery he began. The slaves are taught ignorance as we teach our children knowledge. They are kept in darkness and are born down under a cruel oppression. All human rights are denied them as citizens. They are not recognized as men. My old master frequently said he did not believe a dead nigger had any soul. They are made to undergo everything as a beast, having a full, perfect, undeniable right to stand out before God as men. The cruel God deifying white men without semblance of right, with no pretense, but might have prostituted them to base purpose of his cupidity and his baser beastly passions, reducing them to mere things, mere chattels, to be bought and sold like hogs and sheep, born like the white man to an individual responsibility to the fathers of mercies, the treatment of the white man to the poor African unmixed with mercy. Oh, there go that word again, African. There go that word, African again. But let's continue. Has curtained his mind to all knowledge, even to the knowledge of the God of heaven and earth, and thus remove from him the accountability. But where does this terrible accountability rest? Let the hardened slave tyrant, when he stands quivering before the almighty bar of retribution, answer this question. What might Thomas Jefferson remark when his deep penetrating mind was reflecting upon the stupendous wrongs of slavery. I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just and that his justice cannot slumber forever. I appeal then to every rational, intelligent mind, if slavery be not an abomination in the sight of the Lord. So the question becomes, why was Thomas Jefferson trembling for his country? Why did he tremble? What was he afraid of? Was that guilty conscience? Obviously it was, because he was guilty conscious. He was scared because he owned slaves himself. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves himself. Yep. So he was fearing the uprising against slavery. He was in fear for his life because he saw that there were slave rebellions going on. All right. So before I continue, just give me one moment. All right, so continue. Now, it seems like this autobiography is more so of like a speech that he gave about his life. But it takes a lot of guts. As somebody who was once a fugitive slave, to write a book about your life as a slave coming up. We don't understand the terror and the crisis that our people had to live through in order to have a right as humans. We don't understand those terrors. It's mighty strange when people talk about, well, what would they have done during slavery if they was put in that predicament. You don't know what you would have done because you never lived through that. So you only see it from a 21st century mindset because that's what you're living in 21st century. You could say what you will do in 21st century, but in that time of slavery, you wouldn't know what to do. You'll probably react the same way that many of them did. Because that's just how traumatizing it was. And a lot of us don't know that we carry on these genetics of these individuals, of these ancestors. We carry on the epigenetics. We carry on these traits. We carry on the characteristics. So whatever trauma and fear they dealt with, it lives through us. It lived through us, and it's passed on down. See, once upon a time, I didn't believe in that. I thought that was just an illusion. I thought that it was just nonsense. But it can be scientifically proven that, yeah, you carry on those genetics, those traits. You don't just carry the bloodline, you also carry on some of the characteristics of various individuals that came before you, whether it be your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, or your uncles, your great great uncle, you carry on those traits. You carry on those bloodlines. All right. So now let's go to where it says Stockton and Brooklyn churches. So in 1850, Black was a Baptist minister at the Third Stonington Church in Stonington, Connecticut. There were 26 Sunday school students and 29 adult members, but nearly doubled to 59 before he left in 1851. He obtained a position at the Concord Baptist Church of Christ in Brooklyn, New York in 1851, but left the position shortly after when the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was enacted that required escaped slaves to be returned to their owners. All right. So he was a minister at the Third Baptist Church in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 1855. And the church was formed 1 year earlier and had 40 members. All right. Okay, so it talks about in 1860, his wife Mary Ann him and his wife lived in Brooklyn. Lived in New York. The children were recorded to be living by themselves, and next door were Elizabeth, Lydia, Charles, and Georgiana and Mary, from the ages 18 to 5. Leonard was married to Mary Ann and living in New Haven, Connecticut in 1870. With them, Charles, Georgiana, and Anna, ages 22 to 14. 10 years later, Lennar was married to Mary Ann, who was born about 1835 in St. Thomas. Okay, so it says Black moved to Virginia, where in 1873 he was made pastor of the First Baptist Church, also known as Harrison Street Church in Petersburg. He was successful in doubling the church membership during his time from 1900 to 3,600 people. He preached there until his death. In 1882, Black was interviewed and a biography was written from that interview. So it said he died on April 28th of 1833. More than 5,000 people attended his memorial service, one of the largest funerals held in the city. On the day of his funeral, every store that employed a Black person closed. Funds were raised within months of his death for a stone monument with a bas relief portrait to mark Black's burial site in the African American cemetery, now known as People's Memorial Cemetery in Petersburg. All right. And that's the end from the source from Wikipedia. Okay. So if you guys want to look up more information to verify this source, all you got to do is go to the website. And you can check out encyclopediavirginia.org. Again, encyclopediavirginia.org. All right. So every state, well, not all state, but almost every state, right? Most states in the United States have their own encyclopedia website. So you can find different information from these pages. Georgia got one. I believe North Carolina has one. Virginia has one. Pennsylvania, they all got their own encyclopedia. So all you got to do is put in the name of the individuals that you are looking for that was in those states, and you'll find their biographies on there. So, and all the historical events that has taken place within those states. Okay. All right. So you can just go in and just look at the information to verify. And so pretty much everything I read, right, for the most part, It coincide with the Wikipedia source. Okay, pretty much everything. Now there's some stuff that probably was left out of Wikipedia that can be found on here. All right, so it says here, it says Black attended theological school for a few years, funded with assistance that he said he received from Francis Wayland, president of Brown University, and possibly also with proceeds from the sale of his books. In 1850, Black was serving as a pastor of the Third Baptist Church in Staunton, Connecticut. A year or so later, he moved to Concord Street Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. Then in 1855 to the New Baptist Church in nearby East Brooklyn. His first wife died sometime after 1850, and about 1859 he married Mary Ann Wilden, a member of his East Brooklyn church. They had two daughters who lived to adulthood. Black later stated that he served as a chaplain to troops from New York during the American Civil War, but no record of his service has been located. In 1865, he traveled in Europe and then accepted a call to a church in New Haven, Connecticut. Black moved to Virginia about 1871 to become the second Black pastor of the First Baptist Church in Norfolk. He stayed there for only 2 years, but his congregation valued his integrity and services so highly that on his departure, its leaders published resolution of gratitude in the newspapers. On November 19, 1873, Black was installed as the new pastor of the First Baptist Church, also known as Harrison Street Church in Petersburg. The church was one of the oldest and largest in the state. He spent the rest of his life there, baptizing more than 2,200 persons and nearly doubling the church membership. Black also served as the treasurer of Shiloh Baptist Association and became known for his particular concern for spiritual condition of young men in his congregation, perhaps a reflection of his own hard and sometimes lonely struggle to manhood. His daughters married men from Norfolk, and by 1880, Black and his wife had 4 grandchildren. All right. So it says here that he developed a Bright's disease, a kidney malfunction. By 1882, he was too ill to preach regularly. He recovered sufficient strength to be elected chairman of the State Mission Board of the Virginia Baptist State Convention in February 1883, but soon relapsed. Okay. All right. So yeah, it goes into that information. Again, you can find the source here. Go on encyclopediavirginia.org if you want to look up more. Encyclopediavirginia.org. Okay. That's where you got to go. Now, let's go to the next source. All right. So the next source is his autobiography. Uh, the Life and Suffering of Lennar Black, a Fugitive from Slavery, and was written by him in 1847. In his introduction, it says, in putting this little volume before the public, it is very well, perhaps, that I should speak of my motive. Born and reared in slavery, I was, of course, deprived of education and believing that I can be of service to the public in the ministry. I have published this account of my life and suffering with the hope that I might realize a sufficient sum from its sales to enable me to procure a greater degree of education, thereby increasing my usefulness as a preacher. With this simple statement, I present myself to the humane in the hope that I may not appeal in vain. Lennar Black, April 1847. So it goes into chapter 1. Let's look at chapter 1 of this book. And what he read, he said, it is my objective to give the reader a plain, simple narrative of the more interesting portion of my life while in slavery. So he talks about he was born in Anne Arundel County, state of Maryland, about 60 miles below Baltimore, and lived a slave more than 20 years. He said, my old master was a physician, but I think it's prudent to withhold his name. No one who has always enjoyed the right of liberty can realize the horror of slavery. To be at the will of another, to be owned like a cow or horse, and liable at any moment to be sold to the highest bidder, to be transported to a distant part of the country, leaving the dearest relatives behind, to be in fine, ground down mentally and physically by the untold curses of slavery, may be a very pretty thing to the masters of the peculiar institution, but it is death to the slaves. After more than 20 years of bondage, God delivered me from it with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, as he did Israel of old. As near as I can remember, my mother and sister were sold and taken to New Orleans, leaving 4 brothers and myself behind. We were all placed out. At 6 years of age, I was placed with a Mr. Bradford, separated from my father, mother, and family. But the eyes of God was upon me and blessed me. My master was a carpenter and much from home. Mrs. Bradford beat me so much that her husband sent me to his father. Mrs. Bradford ordered me one day to take a bushel of corn upstairs, but I was unable to do it, upon which she knocked me down with the Johnny Cape board, cutting my head so badly that it bled more than a quart. It was then that I thought of my mother, my little friends who have your liberty and the protecting hand of parents. These are some of the fruits of slavery. Let your hearts warm with gratitude to great giver of all good for the blessing you enjoy. Mrs. Bradford had a son about 10 years old. She used to make him beat me and spit in my face. Here I was a poor slave boy without father or mother to take my part. Wow. At the end of 2 years, Mrs. Bradford beat me so much that her husband, fearing she would kill me, placed me at his father's, where I remained until the death of an old gentleman. But old Mr. Bradford was worse than Mrs. Bradford. He had been a professor of religion, a class leader in the Methodist Church, but at this time he was a backslider, a wanderer from God, and as cold as though he had never been warmed by vilifying the power of the religion of Jesus Christ. And he goes on to say, I lived in this family 7.5 years. And when I left, I was 13 years old. During this time, I had no hat, no pantaloons, but one pair of shoes, and wore a lengthy slip only. I was not allowed to sit down while I ate my meals. For my breakfast, I had a pint of pot liquor, half a herring, and a little piece of bread. Whether this would stay the cravings of a young appetite or not, there was no more to be had. For my dinner, I had a pint of pot liquor and the skin off of the pork. I must say, as the colored people say at the South, when singing to cheer their hearts, while under the burning sun and the crack of the whip, remembering what is placed before them every day for food. My old master is a hard-hearted man. He cats, oh, he eats the meat and gives poor niggers bone. He eats the meat and gives poor niggers bone. At night, I had a bit of bread for my supper and a piece of carpet for my bed, spread down on the hard winter and summer. In the winter, when the fire got low, I used to burn my feet by getting them into the embers. My work in the wintertime was to fetch wood from the swamp up to the house. Being without shoes or hat and thinly clad, I used to go into the house to warm myself. When in the house for this purpose at one time, old Mr. Bradford followed me in and said, "If you want to be warm, I'll warm you." He took the tongs, heat them into the fire, and branded my legs, and the scars are there to this day. I could not sit down in consequence of the wound. He whipped me also and used to put my head under the fence. He whipped me also and used to put my head under the fence. That's the brutality. That's slavery. That's real slavery right there. What he experienced and what he's describing, I know it's traumatizing, right? Traumatizing. But that was the life of slavery. That's what it meant to be a slave. To deal with brutality, not special treatments, not being loved, not being value of human life, but dealing with constant brutality as a fragile animal. That's what it means to be a slave. To deal with brutality as a fragile animal. Now, as you read this story and you read this book, it becomes very traumatizing to read. It makes it hard for you to read. This is why people don't like talking about slavery, because when you talk about slavery, you got to have an open mind, because there's a lot of things that's going to get very traumatizing. It's a lot of stuff that get traumatizing, and it gets scary. But this is what our people dealt with. This is what they lived through. See, this goes to show we don't know slavery like we think we do. We don't really know slavery until we read the narratives and stories of those who have lived it. And this man lived it. And this is why you don't know why many people have joined religion. See, we so quick to come down on our ancestors, say they were brainwashed, this, thing, other. Okay, yes, that may be true. They were brainwashed. Yes, that may be true. They were brainwashed into believing that Jesus was real, or Allah was real, or whatever. But do you know the situation they were placed in? Do you know why they gravitated towards these various Abrahamic religion? Do you know why? They were looking for salvation and peace. One of these days, I am going to do a subject on neurotheology. I have to, because I think that it's very important to understand that when people join various schools of thoughts, it's not so much of just believing in an imaginary God is coming to save them. No, but it's more of the psychology behind it. It's more of the healing process. So for some people, they go through these schools of thoughts to be able to alleviate themselves from their circumstances and to come out being better. It's like a trial and error thing for them. And again, I will have to do a subject to focus on neurotheology, just the subject alone. Okay? So one of these days, I am going to do that. I am going to make it my personal business to put that subject out there, because I think that it would help to better understand why many of us gravitated to, or why many of us grew up the way we did. All right. A lot of our ancestors didn't know about African spirituality. All right. Because a lot of our people didn't grow up on African spirituality. They didn't grow up practicing African traditional religion. They didn't grow up on Voodoo or Ifa or Obia or Lukimi or Santeria or Peo Mayobe. They didn't grow up on that. There were those who did, but a vast majority of them didn't. So they wouldn't know. They only knew what their parents, their grandparents practiced and believed in. And they took on that tradition. But a lot of them didn't know that even with the Abrahamic religion, the African spiritual system was incorporated into it, was synchronized into that. They didn't know. But once you start studying back into history, you see the correlation in those things. Outside of that, a lot of people didn't understand that. All they was looking for was salvation and peace. They was looking for liberation. And they thought they could find liberation by reading the Bible, by going to church every Sunday. They was looking for fellowship, communion, leadership, organization, community activity. This is what they was looking for. Okay? And they thought, and they felt that going to a place like a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple was the place for them to be able to fellowship with one another. But anyways, let's continue on. Let's continue on. And it says, Christian, I beseech you, do not become backsliders, especially slave-holding Christians. For the terrible effects of backsliding, slave-holding Christianity are awfully developed in my history. And then he goes on to say, shortly after this, the death of this man delivered me from his hands. I rejoice. God only knows whether he went to perdition. With all my heart, I have forgiven him. I expect to meet him at the bar of God with the seers and the tongues. Farewell, Mr. Bradford. But this is not all. He left all his properties to his daughter Elizabeth, and her brother Nathan, a tax gatherer, was overseer of the farm for her. 1 year after her father's death, Elizabeth got married to Gardner, a gentleman from Baltimore, a member of the Methodist Church. I then thought I should have a good master, but oh my soul, it was worse and worse. All is not gold that shines, nor silver that glitters. He had not been married a great while before my heart beat and my feet burned. He was a kohler and engaged in burning charcoal and used to draw it to Village Landing and sometimes to Baltimore. One day he left me 25 bushel of coals to draw. By being broken of my rest the night previous, engaged in washing the coal pit, I was tired and sleepy. When I had drawn all the coal out, supposing I had put the fire out, I laid down to rest my weary limbs. The coal burned up. Mr. Gardner, came into the woods where I lay asleep, hollowed and scared me up. He struck me with the shovel and cut my head so I knew nothing for 2 days. I was so weak from the loss of blood that he was compelling to carry me home on his shoulders, covering himself with blood. His wife was very much alarmed. We were about a mile from home, and he told me not to speak of it. Another time, he cut my head with a hoe handle so that altogether I was sick for a long time. Mr. Gardner had a very quick temper and would strike me with anything he happened to have in his hand, reckless of consequences. All right, and that's all I'm just gonna get into because, like I say, it gets pretty emotional. So the title of this book, and you can find it on Google, called "The Life and Suffering of Lennar Black, a Fugitive from Slavery." So that's it for today, and I'm just gonna close this out. When you know the importance of history, right, or when you study history, you will have a different outlook on life. You'll be able to better comprehend why many are in the current state they are in, or why events take place the way they do, why there is a present state. Now, let me go back to one of the videos that I mentioned. How can't you? How can't you? How can't you love a system that treated your people so coldly, and to this day they treat your people very coldly? How can't you love a system like that? How can any black person fist their mouth up and say, I love this system? How can't you fist your mouth up and say that? How can't you love a system that has seriously oppressed you and still oppressing you and giving about injustice? How can't you do it? I just have that question, and I'm gonna continue to ask that question. How can't you love a system that constantly denied you of your history, denied you of your rights, give the injustice that has been done to you, the permanent underclass, which majority of your people is a part of? How can't you love a system like that? How do you love a system? How do you love a system as such? How do you get so comfortable in a system? Why are we so comfortable with this? If we were really the almighty black race like we should have been, we would be interrogating the system right by now. We will be causing a lot of uproar at this moment, and we should be causing uproar. To be honest with you, we should be causing all kinds of problems. We should be raising hell and chaos with the current events that's happening, but we're not. We're too complacent. We're too docile. We're too comfortable. Yeah, we're way too comfortable with this. We're way too comfortable. We're too relaxed. Like we just sit back and we just chill. Like that's what we doing. We just chilling. But anyways, and we're easily distracted too. That's another thing. We so easily distracted. We're easily distracted by a lot of things that serves no purpose to us. But that's just my thoughts. That's just my thoughts though. Anyways, you guys have a good one. And I hope you guys be safe. And until next time, I will connect with you all later. So peace and power elevation be to all of you. And for those of you that's just coming in, tuning in to watch, you have to watch everything from the beginning. Watch from the very beginning. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the channel, share the channel, etc. If you don't want to watch it all the way through, that's fine. You can watch bits and pieces or whatever. Do how you want to do it. It's on you. Just know that the video is available, and also check out my other content on here. Okay. All right. So yeah, be safe. And again, I will connect with everybody And that's it. Peace and power and elevation. All right. I'm logging off. All right, then. Thank you.